Hello again. I wanted to throw in a mini micro sermon just because I found so many pieces of the story were so interesting to me, and I wanted to point out some pieces that caught my eye. So I know the story of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat because I was in the musical as a teenager. And the musical version focuses on the relationships between Joseph and his brothers, and between Joseph and Pharaoh. Like it's all about relationships. And the storyline arc is primarily about the relationship between Joseph and his family. And once the family gets reunited and they are reconciled, that's the end of the story in the musical. But, as I was preparing for today's service, I was reminded that there's much more to the story. And some of that is what we saw in the drama today, right? So at the end, when Joseph was talking to his brothers, and most of what Joseph said there was actually directly taken from the Bible. So these are the words that were used. Um, it said that uh, he was saying to them, "Don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me into slavery in Egypt, because God sent me here to preserve life." God sent me here to preserve life. That was his message to his brothers. So the whole idea was that there's a strong theological message here that God, the whole story has a purpose, right? Joseph and his brothers not getting along had a purpose. Joseph being sold into slavery had a purpose. Joseph being thrown in jail for years had a purpose, because it was from that experience that the wine cupbearer was able to talk to Pharaoh and say, "Oh yeah, there's this young guy named Joseph who can interpret your dreams for you." And that conversation, led to Joseph and Pharaoh working together. And that action saved thousands and thousands of lives. So the idea that God was looking out after people, especially looking out after the Israelites, who definitely would have starved if they hadn't had Joseph, working ahead of time and preparing everyone for the 7 years of famine. So there's that theological message there, right? That God is looking out for the people of Israel. God is caring for them and supporting them. And then we can take the message that God also cares for us and supports us, even in those times when it doesn't seem that that's the case, right? Like I'm sure, when Joseph landed in jail, he wasn't thinking that God was being very kind to him, right? And that maybe God wasn't even there. But in the big picture of the story, we can see that God was there every step of the way, and that all of these things happened so that they would align, and it led to the fact that thousands were saved from starvation. So there's one message from the story, right? That God is with us and God journeys with us through all moments of our lives. But the thing that knocked my socks off was reading the end of the story. And we didn't go into detail about this in the drama just because it didn't really fit with the focus of the drama today. But what happened was Joseph's brothers and his father and all of their family came to Egypt during the second year of the famine. And they were given that lovely place, the lovely land to live on, right? So they were still, they had their cattle, not cattle, goats. Their goats were grazing, everything was fine. But eventually they started to run out of money. And so one year they decided then to start selling off their livestock. And then eventually that ran out and they ran out of money. And they were like, what are we going to do? This famine is still ongoing. How are they going to live? And so they decided to sell themselves into slavery. So they offered their land and their lives to Pharaoh in exchange for Pharaoh providing them with grain for seed. No, the grain for food and for seed and everything that they needed. And, that sounds extreme, but this was one way that they could make sure that they didn't die, right? They didn't starve, because if they belonged to Pharaoh, then Pharaoh would have to take care of them. And the deal that was struck was that 1/5 of the crops that they raised would be given to Pharaoh, and 4/5 of the crop would be left for them. So they could use that part to, have seed for the next crop. They could use that as grain for food, and that's what helped to sustain them. So it was a very generous offer. Um, And it allowed the Israelites to live at least comfortably, because they were still highly esteemed by Pharaoh as being related to Joseph, right? Joseph, this man who just came in and sort of saved everyone, but eventually that Pharaoh died, and the new Pharaoh was a meaner guy, right? And he didn't honor the promises that the previous Pharaoh had made to the Israelites, and he mistreated the Israelites horribly. And it got so bad that eventually Moses appeared on the scene. He was born and then he followed his destiny to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and out of slavery. And, I've never asked the question, well, why were the Israelites in slavery in the first place? How did that happen? Right. And the answer is from our story today. Right. I never connected that the story of Joseph and the story of Moses tied into one another, right? That one led directly into the other. So now we know. Now we know that this is why the Israelites were enslaved. It's because of this long famine. And it wasn't just them, it was everyone who's in Egypt and all around Egypt. Everyone was starving. So Pharaoh ended up amassing a huge number of slaves, which is totally unfair. And no wonder he became so corrupt, right? So that's the piece of the story that I found really interesting because I had never quite realized that or made the connections before. So I hope that that's also interesting to you. So why were the Israelites enslaved by the Egyptians? Because rulers and politicians didn't follow up on their promises. Word to the wise. So once again, I invite you to read the story of Joseph and his family in the book of Genesis. I think you're going to find it's a very interesting story. There are some more details in it that, will help to fill out the story for you and to give it even more depth and meaning. So I highly encourage you just to do that, just to, engage your curiosity and see what else you can notice about the story there. And just a reminder for next week, it is October 29th. We'll have our next service together. And I'm highly encouraging you all to dress up in a Halloween costume for the service. Hopefully, something that's not too scary, or too revealing, but something fun, something that we can share and we can all just get into the spirit of the season. And I promise that I will bring chocolate. So I look forward to seeing you next week, and blessings to you as you continue your worship service today. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everyone.